This next panel is going to be on Governance 2.0. And it's going to be focused on the micro level of governance, so focusing on local and regional policies. And our moderator for this is going to be Traynor. Okay, and I think, Ray, would you like, we've got all our panelists, or, yes,
yeah.
here comes Guy. Okay, I will give the floor to you.
Thank you. Oh, one thing, Nancy's hoping in between sessions. Chris, am I on? Am I on? Hello, hello. Can you all hear me? Excellent, great. All right, well, welcome back from lunch. Yeah. So as you take your seats, I just wanted to make a brief announcement. One of our panel members, Marzia Zafar from the California Public Utilities Commission, just texted us within the last couple of hours, and she's been delayed on a flight back to San Francisco. She's based here, so oddly enough, she's not able to get back to her home and then join us this afternoon. So we're going to be kind of pivoting and rolling with that. We're hoping that Marzia will be able to join us this evening because we've got, I think, a lot of interest in hearing about what went on behind the scenes and maybe what was really at the heart of some of the rulemaking that the California Public Utilities Commission just issued at the early part, I believe it was of September. But just to try to provide some context for this afternoon's discussion on Government 2.0, you know, it's true, as we've learned today and probably back in our days in kindergarten, that sharing is really simple. It's a pretty fundamental part of life in any community. And thanks in large part to the mobile internet, and we've now seen a whole industry be defined around sharing. And this industry seemingly has what we've talked about, maybe unlimited potential. Now, the technology that's connecting us to information, other people, physical things in ever more efficient and intelligent ways. And it's really fundamentally changing how we socialize, mobilize, and now even how we get through and in our communities, whether it's to work, school, or a trip across the state. And whether we're talking about centralized sharing or peer-to-peer sharing, startups over the world are demonstrating that access to the shared asset is becoming more practical than ownership. Now, this rise in sharing really does give rise to a need to adopt a new language, and we've heard this repeated a number of times today, that access trumps ownership. Exchanges are replacing purchases, and consumers are now being replaced by users. We're also seeing a fundamental shift in the way that businesses are redefining their role and their mission, from providers of things to becoming purveyors of services and experiences. And we have to look no further than two of our sponsors. We've got BMW with their Drive Now car and sharing service, and Daimler with Car2Go. So these manufacturers, you know, for them, it's not just about selling a car to one owner. It's really providing access to many with that one car. And at the center of all these shared transactions are trust mechanisms that are derived from online reputation and monitoring systems. And we're spreading by word of mouth now occurs on posts to Facebook and Yelp, and not just in the company of a friend at a coffee house. And so with all this change and this transformation that's occurring, it gives rise to the question about how should government change? How should government examine itself and the way that it operates in light of these sharing networks and sharing systems? Now, in a region where I'm from, like San Diego, we've got housing and jobs that are distributed throughout the region. It's very decentralized. And we've been working for a number of years on a very ambitious long-range mobility plan that relies on increased transit, increased carpooling, increased bicycling. And I'm standing here wondering, what are the opportunities for a region like ours? What are the points that a local government can take regarding shared use? How can we collaborate with these entrepreneurs, these startups, in a new and hopefully beneficial way to the public? And it really kind of comes back to, is it possible for government to position itself to facilitate these benefits that we've heard about? Benefits like increased access, lower costs, reduced environmental impacts, and more efficiencies. So to continue this discussion, we've assembled a panel that includes members from local government, academia, and a thought leader from industry. And we're going to explore what ought to change with respect to government's approach to the sharing economy. And we're going to ask the question, has government been focused on the wrong thing? We're going to hear some opinions expressed about government and perhaps suggesting that government does have a role. So joining me in this discussion are Arun Sundarajan from the New York University Stern School of Business. We've got Kevin Desmond, who is with the King County Metro in Seattle, and Guy Fraker from Get to Know. So beginning with Arun, I'd just like to ask each of the panelists to give a brief introduction to themselves, and then I've prepared a set of questions that we'll run through with each of them. So Arun, if you could go ahead and begin.
Okay, hi, I'm Arun Sundarajan. Thank you for pronouncing my name so beautifully. It's sort of a rare treat at events like this. So I'm a professor at NYU Stern School of Business. I study how digital technologies change things. I've been thinking about, writing about, and doing research about the broader sharing economy for a couple of years now.
I'm Kevin. Is that on? I'm Kevin Desmond. I'm the general manager of King County Metro Transit. We serve Seattle and the greater Seattle region. Before moving out to the Pacific Northwest, I'm from New York originally. I worked for 5 years at the New York City Transit Authority. And before that, one of the stints I did was a couple of years at the New York City Taxi and Limousine Commission, and as well before that in Ed Koch's administration doing transportation policies. So I think I've seen a lot of the different trends over many years from a couple of different perspectives, and I look forward to sharing with you what my organization in Seattle has been doing and it will continue to do.
Excuse me. My name is Guy Fraker, and I'm CEO of a startup on a trust platform called Get to Know. And Get to Know is founded on a real simple mission. We've all said that sharing is access. I'd like to take that a step further and say access is empowerment. And the reason I founded a trust platform after 25 years in the insurance industry and 25 years in risk management was because trust transcends those socioeconomic boundaries. You don't have to have a credit card to be trusted. And I really believe that the shared economy is at the tip of its iceberg in that potential. Now, with the 25 years in risk management and my background, I've been working behind the scenes in the shared economy since 2008 or 9. And when companies want to invest in a shared economy startup, sometimes I get calls about risk management. Had the opportunity to work with Marzia and the PUC when they were first looking at these regulations in how to kind of get their heads wrapped around what this new model is. And so with that background in working with a lot of regulatory agencies and pro forma process, I'm here and happy to share.
Okay, well, let's begin with Arun. And Arun, if you could describe for us what exactly has led to this sudden growth, this explosion that we've seen in shared use mobility, and just the sharing economy business model in general.
Okay, that seems like a good place to start. I guess I can sort of, talk about it in the context of an example. So I live in New York. It's sort of, to me, New York is sort of like, the center of the universe for the United States in terms of the sharing economy, and sort of has been for 5 or 6 decades, which is sort of relevant to sort of the discussion about the government's role that follows. But like most New Yorkers, I don't own a car. And I did for a while, and I would drive it to New Jersey to sort of buy groceries I didn't need just to sort of justify its existence. And then whatever, hundreds of dollars in insurance and parking that I was paying. But sometimes, so I don't own a car, but sometimes I want a car, and sometimes I want it for an hour or two, right? And, I sort of like go outside my apartment, and there are these cars parked on the street, right? And they are there. The only time I see them move is like, middle of the week when they sort of switch from one side of the street to the other side of the street. And, I would always think to myself, wouldn't it be nice if there was some way in which I could, just sort of take one of these cars, take it for a drive, do my thing, bring it back, park it, leave a 20 on the dashboard and sort of move on. And so what I think is sort of fascinating and what sort of has drawn me into studying the sharing economy is that that's actually possible now, right? I mean, and like, all of you know that. It's not possible, doesn't seem to have become a reality in New York City as yet, but it's certainly possible. And I think what's made it possible is there's sort of a set of factors that have played out over the last decade. One is that we carry around, and I've got one of them here, sort of like these powerful computers in our pockets now, right? And I often, when I was a graduate student, there was similar powerful computers that were beginning to be used by organizations. PCs had taken off, client-server technology was popular, and these PCs were being networked and connected to these servers, and so they were able to sort of access information. And companies said, well, let's rip out the old ways that we do work that were constrained by the technologies of the time and replace them with re-engineered work that sort of takes advantage of the fact that we've got powerful computers with network connections and client-server technology sort of available to us. So to me, I think the fact that we've got these things with us now is enabling us to re-engineer our consumption. It's sort of giving us access to platforms and sort of location-based services that allows us to fundamentally rethink the way that we consume. Much like sort of 20 years ago, we had companies sort of rethinking the way that they produced. So there's these devices. I mean, we've got these devices because of a trend that people call consumerization. And this has to do with the fact that for a lot of the leading tech companies, the development of their new tech products is driven not by business needs anymore, but by consumer needs. It's a trend that started with the iPod. But if you think about mobile devices and social media, these things are being built for consumers and then co-opted for business, rather than the other way around. And this reverses a historical trend from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And so the powerful tools that we need in order to re-engineer our consumption are available to us. Social media has led to sites like Facebook, and I bring up Facebook because it's important to me, because what Facebook does for shared use is that it takes real-world social capital, something that can be the basis for trusted peer-to-peer exchange, establishing identity and establishing trust, and it digitizes it and brings it online. So you don't have to create your own trust online. You can just sort of borrow it from the real world. We are used to getting things from the other side of the internet from our peers because of our use of file-sharing networks. We are accustomed to buying things through a digital or a mobile interface. And so, if you ask the question, why has shared use sort of become so popular suddenly now? Sure, I mean, there was sort of, for a lot of industries, the economic downturn that began in 2008 was a catalyst. But there's this culmination of technological factors that I think are really why we've seen such an explosion in the access trumps ownership, sharing economy type model today.
Great, thanks.
Okay.
So you referred to the tools that are being used to re-engineer our interactions. And I wanted to pose a question to Guy, because Guy, you've written pretty extensively about trust and about the new tools that are essentially enabling trust, right?
Yes.
And thinking specifically about the interaction between those who are doing the trusting and those that are being trusted. And you've talked about the need for a greater degree of collaboration among the shared mobility community with respect to the regulatory strategy. And so kind of thinking about this combination of regulation and trust, what kind of role should government play? I mean, is there a role for them in this trust equation?
Yeah, oh, I would say absolutely. And to that end, let's step back for a second and think about the context of what we're all trying to work out and sort through here. Julius Caesar had to pass traffic management laws in Rome, okay? Going back that far, the more people acquire, the more use expands and congests, and entire industries and entire regulatory industries have been on a growth path for 2,000 years. Along comes shared mobility and challenges something that deeply embedded in our society. Let me tell you a very quick story. In 1997, I was working in Oakland and 5 children burned to death in a home. And there was a community outrage because they died because they could not get out of the apartment. And this is very relevant to what we're all trying to do now. So about 100 people watched as these 5 children passed away because there were bars over their windows. Driving by this every day, I called the fire chief, Jerry Bluford, and I said, "You don't know me, but I have a question for you. I'm driving by all these homes. What in the world are you doing about it?" And he shot back with a very appropriate answer to a call from a stranger. He said, "I don't know. What are you going to do about it?" Stopped me dead in my tracks. That afternoon, we formed a nonprofit, and the very first thing we did is we reached out to local legislatures and local regulators and said, "Would you be on our board?" A year later, we had retrofitted 15,000 homes, raised $1 million, and for 10 years, Oakland did not experience one fire fatality. When we reach out and partner and see, we're willing to put our own assumptions on hold, and we reach out to communities who can help enable our growth and success, like the regulatory community can do. Think of all the positive messaging and all of the positive impact we can accomplish in that shared partnership. And believe it or not, in my little story about this tiny Oakland nonprofit we formed one day, a very powerful lobby came out against us. And we're all scratching our heads going, wait a minute, who in the world is going to be in favor of kids dying in their homes? Well, that's not how they looked at it, of course. And so we reached out to this lobby and said, here's a headline. X lobby is in favor of children dying in their homes. How do you feel? And they said, where do we sign on? And that was the end of it, right? My point being, we get wrapped up in our daily business and we know what our goals are. But we can't assume that other people who can enable our success or hinder it understand us as deeply. When we sit down with folks and say, look, we're about mitigating congestion. We're about improving airflow, air quality. We're about improving the quality of life in the city. We're about enabling people to do things that they wouldn't otherwise be able to do, like get a job. Then, I mean, who wants to oppose that, right? My last point here about where this weird little trust space is, there's a basic human reaction or human condition. When we force someone to react, they're going to react to what they know, which may not necessarily be what we want. And in the absence of information, and in the absence of a relationship, a face-to-face conversation, they'll fill in the blanks with what they assume. I'm shocked at the reaction that I consistently get when a regulator calls me and says, this seems like a, can I be frank, this seems like a reckless business model. And I sit back and say, if you knew the extent and the care and concern with which shared mobility companies use to select their members, would you believe it would stand up, be on par with any preferred insurance company already doing business in your state? Oh, wow. No, I had no idea. Why didn't anybody tell us that? Well, I say the shared mobility industry is as concerned about its member safety as you are. Reach out and start with that assumption. Not it's a bunch of 18-year-old kids with $5 million of VC money trying to make money as fast as they can. That's not what this is about. And the thing that is so wonderful about shared mobility is not only does it serve a tremendous societal need, it's commercially viable. How often do those two things come together and provide people in the regulatory community an opportunity to go, wow, I did something terrific today for my town? So my message is, assume that the other person wants to help, inform and educate each other, and build that partnership, because nobody can enable growth in an industry faster than a regulator who is on board.
So, Kevin, I understand that King County Metro for a number of years has been involved in working with innovative and alternative transportation modes and services that are above and beyond providing sort of a traditional or typical bus service. Perhaps you can share from a local transportation agency perspective some of the things that you and your agency have done in this regard to, and sort of the role that that agency's played.
Sure. About many, many years ago, in another century, i.e. the 1990s, there was a little bit of a debate, I think, in our industry about should transit agencies define themselves as mobility managers. And there was debate about that. I think some people within organizations, some cities thought so. Many did not. Many were worried that that was biting off more than a public transit agency could chew. And yet, we find ourselves now in 2013 very much in a place of all of the above. And where once that was a debate, I think increasingly that's not necessarily the case. And there are certainly, like my organizations and others, like San Francisco MTA Muni, can do all of the above. And I think that there's been this tipping point, which I think in both my colleagues on this stage here have in effect referenced through technology and information sharing, as well as the demographic shifts and this increasing interest of the younger generation and older people to live in cities. And it's made it a lot easier for public transit agencies, I would contend, and certainly our story would demonstrate, to be mobility managers. So if you can bear with me for a couple of minutes, I want to maybe chart the course of what our organization in the greater Seattle area has done and how we've evolved into this, not necessarily with a plan. This wasn't, I think, really a conscious plan, at least initially, but it met our policy objectives. It met the needs of and the interests of our community. Many, many years ago, King County Metro, at least the story is, was one of the first, if not the first, large public agencies to put bike racks on its buses. We embraced biking. We've now come a long way. All of our fleet has not only bike racks, but 3-position bike racks, which I think is still somewhat unusual in the United States. We try to put bike lockers and bike stations at all of our major facilities. Embracing that as an alternative mode, as a way before the phrase first mile, last mile even became au courant. It was just understood. A lot of people wanted to use a bike to get on the bus to go where they're going so they can continue on their bike, so we met a need. Incidentally, we also, one of the first agencies to put lifts on the buses for people with wheelchairs. Met a need. It was before the Americans with Disabilities Act. It met a need. We were responsive to our local community. More than 20 years ago, 25 plus years ago, Boeing, you've heard of Boeing, big company, They weren't located in downtown areas, of course. Their plants were out in the suburban areas. They were really off the beaten track in the context of where fixed route buses could work or be efficient. Well, we responded to a need because they just didn't want to build so much parking for all their employees at their plants, and we created this thing called the van pool program. And then fast forward, we've got the largest, still the largest publicly owned van pool program in the United States. In fact, possibly by the end of this year, early next year, we'll probably have more vans in our fleet than buses. We have over 1,300 vans now. And the van pool program, incredibly cost effective. It recovers all of its operating costs through its fares. And its fares are really no different, particularly than, depending on your distance, than a bus fare, or now in our region, and commuter rail as well. Fast forward some more, there was another niche demand. The first mile, last mile is people were either going to a transit station, say a train station or one of our transit centers, or arriving at a major destination like, let's say, King Street Station in downtown Seattle. But they still needed another way to get to their final destination that the fixed route system didn't work with. We created what we call the van share program within the van pool program, but it's basically a car sharing program, but it's organized up front, and now we have 25 Nissan Leaf electric vehicles as part of that as well, which are incredibly popular. People just think it's absolutely cool that they get to play in a Nissan Leaf provided by our organization. Again, these programs extremely cost effective that meet a niche that our public transit organization or the fixed route transit system could not effectively had put together. In 1991, the state of Washington passed the Commute Trip Reduction Act, known as the CTR law. There's no teeth to that, but it encourages large employers with more than 100 employees who arrive and leave work during peak periods, to increase their non-SOV mode share. There's no sanction. There's nothing happens to any of those companies if they don't comply with that regulation. It's an aspirational goal, let's say. But it opened up the door for our public transit organization and the other organizations in the Central Puget Sound region to start working intensively with employers. Fast forward, we created something called FlexPass, a loss leader program, and we say, look, you company, big company like Boeing, Microsoft, smaller company, a consultant company, a little manufacturing company, if you give a transit pass to every single one of your employees, we'll basically give it to you at a deeply discounted rate. Loss leader, because the more transit passes in people's pockets, the more likely that they're going to try transit. The more people who try transit, or van pool, FlexPass is good for van pool as well, the more likely we're going to build market share. Fast forward, we have relationships with 1,500 businesses alone in King County, 1,700 in the Central Puget Sound region. Microsoft gives 50,000 passes to all of its employees, in addition to operating its own Microsoft Connector service. That's the Microsoft's version of what you heard about on Google Bus. And now that program, delivered through our electronic smart card, we sell 275,000 passes annually to businesses in our region. And it's viewed as an employee benefit. You can get van pool as well as part of that. In 2000, this fledgling company called FlexCar arrives on the scene. Wasn't making any money. Who knows if this thing could even work? Well, King County Metro, finding some grant money to help seed the beginning of FlexCar helped it get on its feet in Seattle. Then fast forward again, it's now Zipcar. It's now a really strong profit-making going concern. So the point of all of these things that I'm bringing up is, why did we get involved in that? We're a transit agency. You know, isn't biking sort of competitive with the bus? Isn't van pool, van share competitive with the bus? Isn't car sharing competitive with the bus? We now have the car to go. There are little vehicles all over the place in Seattle. Isn't that competitive with the bus? Why would you be working with your competitors? For us, they fill the niche. They help grow mobility in the region. And it's a way that actually, in my view, and I think it's worked out that way, really has strengthened the overall public transportation, broader mobility of a region that floats everybody's boat up higher. So we can engage ourselves in all of these different functions and service features, I think in a very strong way, and we don't have to put a lot of money forward to it either. We've helped get bike sharing going, and we hope to launch it early next year, spring of next year. We've helped leverage grants. That's one of the things we can do as a transit agency, leveraging whether it's federal grants, state grants. In the case of bike share, it's both, using our own staff to help seed it. We don't have an interest in subsidizing it forever. But we think, as we've seen now, you've heard chapter and verse already here today, they're all over the world and they're making money. If we can help seed those innovations and we can be smart and help them get on their feet, we see that as being a very successful element of our programs. I'd love to see bike share stations at our BRT stations. We have 4 BRT routes in the Seattle region. We're going to have 6 by June of next year. First mile, last mile, great place to put bike share. So it can be all of the above, and it can very much fit in with our own programmatic objectives, and ultimately, and my boss is King County government directly, and there are a lot of policies that have been passed by King County that very much undergird and support the things that we do.
So the challenge that I see, government has a real struggle to be an innovator. We're hearing that government has a possibility, and certainly in King County, you've demonstrated this ability to collaborate. Sort of innovative in itself, right? So, Arun, I'd like to turn to you for a moment, because government seems to take a role of regulation often. That seems to be the reaction, is to try to control as opposed to, say, unleash.
Yeah.
And last year you wrote a pretty influential op-ed piece in Wired called Why the Government Doesn't Need to Regulate the Sharing Economy. And I thought, really? So can you explain your reasoning here?
Okay, sure. I mean, for those of you who have written op-eds, you know the reality that the one part of an op-ed that the author doesn't get to control is the title. That's sort of like, especially with Wired, they have algorithms that are figuring out sort of what will maximize viewership and so on. And so, I mean, but, that would just to sort of leave it at that would be a cop-out, right? So the point I made, it wasn't called Why Government Has No Role in the Sharing Economy. And it didn't, so I mean, like, so it wasn't the position that, like, government has nothing to do with this. Or that, we've already heard sort of stories of how, from both our other panelists of, like, how that would sort of just be flawed. And it actually didn't say why the government doesn't need to regulate the sharing economy. The point that it really made was that, and I sort of expanded on this in sort of a TechCrunch thing about a couple of months later, was really that there's, I mean, going back to New York as an example, most cities are built on some notion of sharing. Long before we had smartphones and platforms, there was some notion of sharing. I mean, there have been yellow cabs, there's been shared transit. We don't have personal gardens, we share parks, we share, lobby space in co-ops. I mean, there's a whole bunch of sharing. A lot of us don't cook all of our meals. We eat at restaurants. We have stuff delivered. And so there have been all these analog ways of sharing, in some sense, that predate this digital era of shared use mobility, right? And we've needed ways to keep them safe and to make the market work. Perhaps if there weren't, fair controls and licensing and a whole host of other regulations on the yellow taxis in New York, the market wouldn't work. People may not feel safe getting into a taxi. And so you need the government to step in. And that's when regulation makes sense. When there's a market that could exist, but it's going to fail unless the regulator sort of makes it safe. So that's one role that a regulator could play. And so the point that I made was that, now that we've moved to or we're moving into an era where there's a whole host of sharing that is mediated by digital platforms, that have their own trust mechanisms, that sort of build their own reputation systems, that have new monitoring technologies that are facilitated by digital technologies again, the role of government starts to change. That there's a whole host of screening, perhaps, that the government needed to do. There's a whole host of rules that the government needed to set. Some of these may not be necessary anymore. Now, in parallel, the government's role will probably shift from, there's the catalyzing role for sure. There are sort of infrastructure roles. But in this sort of regulatory sort of role, that perhaps a lot of the screening and sort of prevention things that the government had to come in for are going to be taken care of by the marketplace themselves. But there may be a whole bunch of other quote-unquote cure roles, because if you, instead of having one uniform taxi service in a city, if you have 50 different ride-sharing companies, 20 different platforms, there are probably a bunch of exceptions that are going to be created. To sort of borrow and paraphrase and perhaps distort, one of the things that Lisa just said. The sharing economy has not yet sort of developed its scar tissue. The sort of the digital sharing economy. We don't yet know what all the exceptions are. And for that, we need the government to sort of be there. The role of the government doesn't have to be in the screening and the prevention as much as it used to be. But there is perhaps an alternative and maybe even expanded role for the government in terms of, making sure that if something goes wrong, that there's a place of last recourse. And and so that was really sort of that complex sort of nexus of arguments was summarized as government doesn't need to regulate the sharing economy. I think at that point, that was sort of a message that a lot of people wanted to hear. But I'm very sort of encouraged by what I saw the CPUC do last month. And, that's sort of been in the works for a while. I'm not suggesting that this is the perfect regulation or the perfect approach. There are lots of rules that have been specified. But what I think is really encouraging is that they have shifted a lot of the enforcement and sort of monitoring responsibility from a centralized government agency to the platforms. They have delegated these roles to the TNCs. Maybe in sort of an idealized future in a decade, a lot of these will be set and sort of handled by the platforms, by the TNCs themselves, the transportation network companies like Lyft and Sidecar. Maybe they will sort of self-manage because they would have figured out better than a government regulator can what is it that sort of makes their market work the best. That has to be counterbalanced by the fact that they're profit-making entities and that the government has to perhaps sort of provide some input in a way that sort of balances. We don't want a situation like what's happening with digital rights management, where what used to be a contract between a musician and a listener, mediated by the government through copyright, has now become something that Apple controls, right? What you can and can't do with your music isn't decided by copyright, it's decided by Apple. What you can and can't do with your books is going to be decided by Amazon and not by copyright. And this is not an idealized situation. It's sort of the reality of technology. But so you need government in there to sort of check that. But this idea that you're moving responsibility from a centralized sort of place to enforcement, if someone is in violation of these rules, Lyft can disconnect them from the platform. They actually have sort of superior enforcement capability, right, costlessly. And so I'm encouraged by that. I think that perhaps we will see a bunch of these transition models where there is rulemaking by the government but enforcement by the platform as sort of a transition phase between the present, which is sort of centralized, and thank you, Lisa. That's between the present, which is sort of sort of centralized regulator setting rules, and the idealized future, which is platform sort of determining everything. And so I mean, to me, I mean, like, through my own sort of self-centered eyes, when I saw these regulations, I'm like, yeah, I mean, they must have sort of read it and they must have listened, because, this is exactly what I was talking about. So anyway, that's sort of I suffer from this thing called RTST, which is reluctance to stop talking. Sort of a common affliction at these conferences. But sometimes when I've given a glass of water, that helps. So I think I'll sort of pause for a minute there.
Well, I'll help you with the RTSD.
Yeah.
And I'll ask a question to all three panelists, and we can come back to you. So, it seems like we've heard this before, though. We've heard from industries, let us regulate ourselves.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if we could just unpack for a minute, help us understand what's different. You talked about these mechanisms. There's certainly a technology component to it. You talked about the social sharing. Is that really the foundational difference here?
Well, really briefly, I'll say that there are digital trust mechanisms that we didn't have before, and that there are digital monitoring mechanisms that we didn't have before. I'll sort of let my other two panelists sort of expand on this, but this to me is sort of like the two big differences in the new generation of peer-to-peer marketplaces that we're seeing. Sort of better digital reputation and trust, and potentially better digital monitoring. And so this changes the technological reality. It changes sort of the just to sort of go back to copyright as an example, if the rules on copyright said that you can only read a book 3 times, maybe the government decided that that was sort of the right balance between the author, read it 3 times, then you have to buy it again. Under the old technology, where you sort of bought a paperback, this would be a meaningless rule, right? Because what are they going to do? Sort of like, come and take the book away from you when you... How are they going to monitor? On the other hand, this kind of thing is actually enforceable through a digital rights management system, right? And so that's what I mean by an example of sort of like the technological reality has changed. Monitoring is more possible. Enforcement is more possible. And then there's the trust component that I'm sure, like, sort of Guy has a lot to say about. But that's also another thing that has changed, that perhaps reduces the need for some of the rules that are sort of government screening rules.
My starting point on that is the debate from only a few years ago, really, about the access to our data, to transit agency data. And that's a fairly new thing in our industry. We have data. We have lots of data, and as transit agencies, for example, increasingly brought GPS systems to know where our buses and our trains are at any given time. There's question whether or not we would provide our data, whether in a standardized format or otherwise, to application developers. And few agencies, unnamed, resisted that initially, I think because their lawyers were asked the question first. Other agencies, probably where their marketing people were asked the question first, were much more liable to release that information. So I think what we've seen now in just these few short years, and I think we saw that particularly in Tim's remarks at the beginning of the day, that letting these developers gain access to our data will create these fabulous products, some of which may not be so good and some of which are really going to hit. And they're going to be a tremendous tool that a lot of people will use in ways that we as public organizations would never be able to do it. The sort of the quip I use around the office, whatever it is, it'll take us a year and $1 million, so to speak. So we have to be willing, from my perspective as a CEO of a public agency, to let these entrepreneurs, to let the private sector interests, to let people who are trying to innovate, let them innovate. Another example, whether it's FlexCar, Car2Go, or the Microsoft Connector, or the other private van operators, say in Seattle, they're competing for something that's important to me, and that's curb space. I need that curb space for my buses, for my bus stops, to lay over my buses and so forth. So, initially when Microsoft started talking to the city of Seattle, they said, well, we want to make a lot of stops throughout Seattle, and a lot of those stops might be where Metro stops. Well, you need to ask Metro's permission. Our first reaction was, ooh, hell no, that's no good. But you know, fairly quickly, we kind of figured out that's not the right answer. So again, little thing, it is a little bit of a regulatory issue where we're in partnership with the City Department of Transportation. We need to come to the answer yes, and we need to come to the answer yes a lot quicker than perhaps in the past. So, you know, we don't get involved in some of the other, you know, ability to provide data, regulating these now peer-to-peer types of things. But I guess from my perspective, the point is let them bloom, let them happen, let them flourish, and let's get to the answer yes a lot faster than perhaps our bureaucratic and our lawyered way of doing things, and even our risk managers. It's really cool that I'm sitting next to a risk manager in a conference like this, or a former risk manager, actually. You know, those are the people we might have turned to in the first place, and they're so conservative, because they're just trying to protect your bottom line, that the answer tends to be no, 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 and it takes you a long time to get yes. Let's just find a way to get yes a lot faster.
We're having a sort of a distressingly high amount of agreement among the panelists.
Mm-hmm. Guy, do you take a supporting position, or?
Well, I'm going to take somewhat of a little bit of a counterintuitive position here and say that government absolutely can be innovative. And to the point that's already been built on, you know, there are two ways when you know you've arrived. When somebody like the International Hotel Group is scared of you, or taxi industry, or when a regulator says this is a valid industry. And one of the ways I think that a lot of the regulatory and risk management community can be very innovative is by, and again, not to say the PUC regulation was ideal, because I mean, there are a lot of people who would say the best regulation is none, but that's not realistic. When you have enough regulation to validate your existence, but to stay out of the way so that you can bloom, particularly in a peer-to-peer space where there are these trust mechanisms, and it is an agreement between two private individuals, it's going to be a tricky balance, but that is a way that the regulatory community can be innovative, is to recognize the public good and recognize the business benefits and recognize the societal benefits and step back and say, we're going to protect you. Keep in mind, a minimal level of regulation or some level of regulation that does let you bloom does provide shelter. Can provide shelter, because there will be a lot of people behind the scenes saying, these guys are reckless. Are you kidding? Two strangers meeting in a parking lot, can you imagine all the things that go wrong? Please stop this. Well, no. We know what the risks are. We're adults, right? And so let me suggest to you that with a little bit of information and having that relationship and reaching out and collaborating, government absolutely can be innovative in this day and age, because they're also privately members of many of our organizations. And so I would say that this is really a great time for the shared economy, because you do have more and more regulators saying, we're not going to get in the way of this one. We want millennials to stay in our cities. We don't want New York to be less competitive than Chicago. If we get in the way of this, this could be one to come back and bite us. Let's help. And so I think there's absolutely a partnership and a role for government risk management and entrepreneurs in the shared economy.
So we heard earlier that the uptake of the shared use mobility tends to be focused on the millennial generation. There's some speculation about the fact that maybe we don't see as much use of these services among low-income and minority populations. So I'm wondering, is there a role for local government to help ensure accessibility with respect to these shared use mobility services among communities of concern?
Yeah, I'll speak to that real quickly, going back to my Oakland story. We had all this money for grants to give to people so that they could retrofit these bars with bars that released. And it was getting the regulatory community on board and getting the legislators on board turned out to be the easy part. We couldn't give this money away because they didn't trust the source. They didn't know us from Adam. So when we got the local city council members and some of the community leaders on board, and we got the churches on board and said, come to us, we'll help fill out your grant application. We'll help get you the money for your home. We were out of money in no time. And I think there is a role, but I would be cautious in making sure we understand why underserved communities may not be as involved. Is it as simple as the fact that people don't have a credit card? I mean, look, millennials are graduating with a debt equal to boomers' mortgages. Think about that. Credit scores are a horrible measure of somebody's trustability. And so I think there's a huge role where the shared mobility can be protected and endorsed in a way by local community leadership that can very much help, maybe with a prepaid plan. I have a good friend who lives in Chicago who is a multi-billion-dollar hedge fund manager, retired at 43, and you can imagine the cars he owns, right? He said, when peer-to-peer car sharing comes to Chicago, I'm going to sign up because I understand underutilized assets. And I said, are you going to care what the street address is of the person who rents your car? Because it's probably not going to be in your neighborhood, right? He said, look, if they have insurance, I'm okay. What do I care where they come from? Now, that doesn't have to be atypical. And so I think there's very much a place where local government and local community leaders can say, it's okay, and there's a way to get this done.
I mean, I do worry, though, that, I mean, first of all, I mean, to your question, yes, I mean, like, you know, there's certainly a role for government to play there. And, you know, I mean, smartphones and credit cards seem to be sort of gateways to sort of the current sort of peer-to-peer sharing economy, and you know, the distribution of these across the population is not uniform. But I don't know, in thinking about sort of what we've talked about, I mean, it's true. I mean, like, you know, sort of government can be sort of an instrument of innovation. There are hopefully government regulators who are saying, you know, I want New York to be more competitive than Chicago, and so let me sort of stay out of the way. And I certainly saw a lot of support at the U.S. Conference of Mayors and sort of the Shareable Cities resolution. But I'm not sure that that's not the entirety of the reality, right?
Oh, no.
And I'm wondering if there's sort of, you know, I've been wondering how, you know, to get from, you know, sort of this idealized notion of here's the right division of responsibilities between the government and the platform, to sort of a more realistic, here's a path that we can take, and here are sort of some strategies that we can think about and present to sort of government regulators that take into account not just the longer term sort of broad vision things of we want our city to be competitive and we want the millennials to come, but take into account sort of other short-term impediments, you know, sort of even sort of a well-meaning regulator has other sort of vested interests that may be sort of like, you know, causing them to make choices in particular directions. And so, you know, it's, you know, I think a big challenge for, you know, sort of government 2.0 or government 3.0 or sort of shared use, you know, whatever we want to call it, sort of like the new role of government, is sort of us being able to sort of identify a path to that end, where, like, you know, a realistic path to that end. And, you know, I guess I think about it from the perspective of, you know, New York and San Francisco are very different cities when it comes to, I mean, well, New York City's government is just sort of immense, right? I mean, I think it's like federal government, then you've got California, then you've got New York State, and then New York City is number 4, sort of bigger than Texas and all the other governments. I mean, the Department of Health employs 6,500 people. It's monumental, right? And perhaps we needed it because, you know, largely because, like, you know, we are a sharing economy, and we have been for a long time, and there was sort of a need for this to sort of be kept safe, and so we ended up with sort of a much bigger government than most other cities. But I work also, in addition to sort of the Stern School of Business, I'm closely affiliated with a new initiative that's sort of centered at NYU called the Center for Urban Science and Progress, which sort of a partnership between NYU, Carnegie Mellon, New York City, and 4 other universities. And we're trying to sort of imagine ways in which government can do the things that they need to do more efficiently using data. And sort of how can we build better cities and use New York as a laboratory for that. And in talking to agencies as part of this, it seems like the reality that they face is sort of different from this idealized, like, let's get out of the way and let innovation bloom. And so, I don't know, I guess that's a question, or maybe it's a question, maybe it's just an observation, but it seemed like worth bringing up because, this sort of like change management path seems at least as important as sort of the conceptual, sort of, since I'm the academic on the panel, I feel that I should sort of bring a little realism into the picture. But yeah, let me just sort of stop there.
So let me bring some realism and practicality from my perspective. What turns me on about everything that's being discussed at this event, this shared economy, and what turned me on about the mobile app that the kids from the University of Washington created with our information, that it would have been just too hard and expensive for us to create, is that these new services, these new features in our cities, in our communities, are incredibly efficient. My business is incredibly inefficient. It's very, very expensive. It will always be very expensive for reasons that we can have another conference to talk about. So that's why, yes, government can innovate. Government can innovate by helping to seed smart ideas and then to get out of the way. That's kind of the, in my view, the sort of the story of FlexCar, of us helping to get it started. And then eventually government just, sort of getting out of the way and allow it to find its market. And now it's got a market. Something's happened. So for me, all of these different features, whether it's widespread use of information or new mobility products themselves, that's when I said earlier, floating everyone's boat up. It's dramatically increased, or has the potential to dramatically increase the overall efficiency, in my world, of the transportation network, that we could not, as a government, possibly even remotely replicate. That's why it's important for us to help to be among the mobility managers in our region, but not to try to be the mobility manager, because we would then probably end up crushing innovation.
Well, let's turn it over to you, the audience. Do you have questions for our panelists? Right over here. If you could just stand up if you've got a mic. If not, use your booming voice.
My question is mainly for Kevin. I'm a transit operator. Thanks. I'm a transit operator. And I happen to operate over a mega region. And a goal of mine is to get bike sharing to be uniform, one fob across that mega region. And you have a similar situation. You got lots of cities, and you're starting bike sharing for Seattle, and maybe next door it won't be the same company that wins that procurement bid. How does government facilitate something that makes sense like that, or do you wait for technology to come along and the company that innovates says, we'll take care of the fob stuff at a higher level, and it won't be this bike sharing company and this bike sharing company?
Probably a fairly easy answer, and there might be people in the audience who do bike sharing either disagree or will have help me with the answer. So Vancouver, BC is going to be starting bike sharing. Seattle's going to be starting bike sharing. Portland's going to be starting bike sharing. So in our little Cascadia region, we're going to have the certain critical mass in our major urban centers. If they work in all three cities, I don't know if it's really going to work. I hope it's going to work in Seattle and the University of Washington, and maybe across Lake Washington and Redmond, where Microsoft is. Those are the interested parties. If it works in these places, and if we see a growth potential, what government can do is can then help start to set standards. Doesn't have to be the same company. So the company that we're working with or that Portland or Vancouver is working with to manage and operate their bike share doesn't have to be the same company. It doesn't have to be a monopoly. Probably we wouldn't want it to be a monopoly. But if you set certain standards so that you might have the same mobile app to sign up and register when you're instead of in Seattle, maybe Tacoma will have one, maybe Olympia, maybe Vancouver, Washington, and on into Portland, et cetera, et cetera. If there's a certain standard that you can gain access, therefore, to everybody else's bike share, even though they're operated by different people, and you have maybe a back office clearinghouse in how the money's allocated, presto, it works. I mean, that's the future as well of our ticketing. Those mobile ticketing applications are they're proven, and I hope they'll start to become ubiquitous. So ultimately, someone with your smartphone, whether you're in New York City, San Francisco, or Seattle, you want to take a transit trip, you go on a little app, you get your ticket, and you get on our bus, you get on our trains. That could easily happen, I think, for bike share as well. That's where the role of government can help without getting in the way and stanching innovation or adding so many different costs and regulatory burdens to make it, then you'd have to subsidize it. Just add a certain standard in place to say, hey, we just want you to talk to one another.
Other questions? Right here.
Hi, it's not a question. This is for Kevin. I'm very impressed with what you've done in Seattle, but I would like to challenge you. I work for an innovative ride-sharing tech company, and I hear you saying, let them innovate, let them bloom, but I think that governments have a huge power to actually promote shared mobility. And I'm going to give you the example of the city of New York after Sandy, when Bloomberg said at 2 p.m., he said, okay, at 6 o'clock today, no car can enter Manhattan without 3 people or more in a vehicle. A few hours later, this was enforced for a few days. And I think if me as a tech company, my focus is on improving technology and making the tool as efficient as possible for people and for cities. But I think as government, don't let me innovate by myself. Just please promote, have a more proactive role. And I think you have a huge power to enforce more shared mobility in the cities.
Well, first of all, don't get me wrong. I didn't say government can't innovate. In my view, government can innovate. Government can't generally innovate nearly as efficiently and quickly as the private sector for many institutional reasons. I'm not sure I understand your example. Your example of what Mayor Bloomberg did was in the context of emergency, and he was able to enact emergency powers. What we do in our region, and why my organization does all of these things as a mobility manager, that's outside of the direct context of my major mission and where I spend the overwhelming amount of our budget, which is fixed route transit, is because as a matter of public policy for King County government, which is my boss, City of Seattle government, we do in fact promote doing something other than SOV, and we work very closely with the private sector. So for example, our great example, we have a partnership with the Seattle Department of Transportation and the Downtown Seattle Association. The DSA is an entity that represents the property owners in downtown Seattle, so the towers. They want to build more towers. They want to build more big buildings. They want more business in a very, very tightly constrained area. And they figured out they can't build enough parking. Their pro formas don't work. And the only way you can fit more people downtown and therefore more profitable development is to get more non-SOV travel. So the business community with us and the City of Seattle set as a goal a 6 percentage point market share shift from SOV to non-SOV, which we have, I think we made 10% market share improvement, and we're on a long way to improve that even more. So we collectively, with business interests, in our case, are promoting, and very much promoting, lots of different ways to get around and to move around and to help support these types of innovations to help support building bike lanes, building cycle tracks, helping with, we're partners with the city on the bike share. So we can do a lot. Government can do a heck of a lot through policy, through regulatory approaches, and just flat out just through urging business and citizens to try different ways to get around. And I think we have a success story to talk about in Seattle.
Yeah, I think I just used this example because I thought it was a shame that we had to wait for an emergency to enforce such a rule, that this type of rule could be applied any day. A mayor can decide that from today, we want to enforce that and call the tech companies to help them accomplish that goal. And I give you another example of a city in Italy. When we launched our ride-sharing service, we approached the city, and the city sent a letter to all the citizens of that city, Parma in Italy, 200,000 people, to just say, hey, we just want to let you know there's a new service in town. This is carpooling in our case. And we don't have the power to do that. The communication, marketing, and we don't know the citizens, and we don't know their needs. And the city knows, the needs they have.
There's this phrase, never waste a good crisis, but the flip side of that question is New York City's been thinking about congestion pricing for many years. Has been blocked time and again. So there's a certain point you can't get too far ahead of the public. So it was easy to do in a crisis situation, but to enact things like that, where you're cordoning off your cities and forcing people to use HOV instead of their own car, you still have to go through a political process. And if you get too far ahead of the general public, you're going to end up failing. So you still have to be mindful of public opinion. That's reality.
They also say there's a common language, too, and it's the language of data. And we've heard that over and over again. But one way to absolutely garner that kind of support and leverage that kind of communication machine is to speak the language of data. And there has been a defined hesitancy for very good reasons for organizations to share their data. And I've said for years that is the key that will unlock the door to exponential growth. And so that is a language both private and public sectors can find common ground on.
We have time for one more question.
Can I quick comment on congestion pricing, though? Because New York City passed it. It's New York State that said no. So just in terms of getting out too far in front of the people, New York City Council, and it's true, for 60 years they've been talking about congestion pricing in New York City. In the most recent conversation, which was 5 years ago, the City Council asked for what's called a home rule, in which they asked the state to allow them to implement it. The state said, you can implement it, you just can't enforce it, which basically means you can put a basket out and people can throw some money in as they drive by. So it was actually the state that said, so it's, that's a different regulatory problem, but that's just, excuse my French, but a pissing match between the state and the city. So.
And meanwhile, Uber seems to have sort of implemented some version of that on their app in New York City quite seamlessly. So
our final question over here.
Hi, Tim Pavendra from MTA. I think I'd love to get your thoughts on some of the governance issues that we've been struggling with about too much regulation, not enough regulation. Where is that happy medium? In the transportation network companies and the taxis, for example, taxis are, some argue taxis are over-regulated. There's so many rules they have to follow. Yeah. And the TNCs are just starting, and they're very concerned about going down that same road because many of the regulations are a century old. So I'd love to get some thoughts on where is that level playing field? How do we make it fair? And how do we make both of those groups thrive, where one is feeling really threatened and under attack, and has resultantly complained and become very resistant to these changes, and this new group is kind of trying to fit their foot in this mix and is kind of struggling and saying, if we go down that regulatory path, we may not exist either. So there's this kind of, for us who has to manage both of them, it's a real question right now about what is our real role in this. And the second part of this piece is on the accessibility. taxis are required to be accessible. There's a certain amount of them that they have to actually buy physical vehicles that can have wheelchair access. It's interesting to see where does that fit now in with the TNCs to make them accessible if they're going to be this widespread. So, love to hear your thoughts because we're struggling with this right now.
Well, I think that the TNCs are trying to sort of enforce these accessibility rules. I mean, sort of like, these accessibility fractions as well. At least like my conversations with them suggest that they're trying hard to sort of raise those percentages to, a particular minimum. It's hard to say, right? I mean, what what the perfect path forward is. I mean, in some sense, the approach that the sort of like CPUC seems to be taking is, like, while delegating to the platforms, sort of let's put everything in there and then sort of knock them out as they become irrelevant. And so it's sort of a risk-averse, that's their risk management strategy, is one of sort of like, playing it safe. And then you have, even despite that, I don't know, I stepped out a bit in the morning, so maybe he's here, but there's a San Francisco taxi driver called Trevor. I don't know if any of you, he writes a blog. He's actually sort of leading a movement to go around and collect the license plates of Lyft and Sidecar and then, like, send them to their insurance companies as a sort of way of pointing out that perhaps they're doing something that sort of goes beyond. So I read his blog with sort of great interest because it's sort of, he's very motivated. He's sort of like the extreme example of a group that is feeling sort of disenfranchised in some way because they feel that, like, the system is moving against them. He even says, well, they even sort of tweet their locations. They make it so easy for me. They're like generating all this data, and then I go and take a picture of this license plate. But I guess it's sort of a, so the safe approach would probably be the sort of the TNC, CPUC, sort of setting up the TNC with a whole bunch of rules. And then as you gather data on what is really necessary and what isn't, you start to sort of remove them. You remove the rules rather than, because I think it's easier to take one out than to put a new one in. Yeah, but the alternative is to sort of take the, I'm sort of obsessed with this sort of scar tissue thing, right? Of like, saying that, well, let's sort of have a light-handed regulatory approach, and let's, let some scar tissue sort of emerge and then learn from it and correct it. And so I don't think that, I guess the short answer is that sort of conceptually there is no right approach. I think it has to do with sort of like, the appetite for risk that the regulator sort of has in terms of like, what might work given the multiple stakeholders that they have to deal with.
I'll need to step in. I'm sorry, Guy. We're a little bit over time. So what I would invite you to do is have this conversation maybe during our break, but I apologize for having to interrupt, but we are about 5 minutes over. So with that, I just want to take the moment to thank our panelists. Obviously a lively discussion. Thank you so much. Thanks a lot, everyone. Appreciate it.